Welcome to the latest IA webinar with me, Syed Kamall. I'm a Professor of Politics and International Relations at St Mary's University in Twickenham, and I'm also the Academic and Research Director at the Institute of Economic Affairs. Today I'm joined by a panel with a wide range of views to discuss the future of the BBC, touching on questions such as, should the BBC continue to be funded by the licence fee, or another form of tax or fee, or is it time for another way? Some argue that changes in the world of multi-channel TV, streaming services and the internet suggest that the current approach to financing, ownership and regulation of the BBC is outdated and no longer tenable. Others suggest that the BBC is a vital tool in the UK's soft power and plays a crucial role in British life and tells a valuable story of the UK. We may also touch on issues such as decriminalisation of non-payment of a licence fee, alleged bias and forthcoming reviews. To discuss these issues, I'm delighted to be joined by a panel with a range of views. Professor Philip Booth is Senior Academic Fellow at the IEA and Professor of Finance, Public Policy and Ethics at St Mary's University in Twickenham. He recently wrote an IEA paper, New Vision, Liberating the BBC from the Licence Fee, which made the case for a subscriber-owned BBC. His report was the inspiration for today's event. Mark Damazer, CBE, is a former Master of St Peter's College, Oxford, and a former controller of BBC Radio 4 and BBC Radio 4 Extra, who argues that the BBC is important as a non-partisan source of news, so cuts to BBC funding will damage this valuable output. So Robbie Gibb is a public relations professional, political advisor and broadcast journalist. He was formerly head of the BBC's political programme output and also Director of Communications at number 10 Downing Street. He believes the BBC should be impartial and universal to justify the licence fee. We hope to be joined by Julian Knight, MP, who's been a Member of Parliament for Solihull since 2015. He's a former journalist for the BBC and then The Independent. Since 2016, he has sat on the Digital, Culture, Media and Sports Committee. He became chair of that committee in January 2020. He has the unenviable task of weighing up these arguments. You've heard enough from me. Why don't we move on to the discussion and start with Professor Philip Booth. Philip, over to you.
Okay, thank you very much, Syed, and thank you very much for joining us, Robbie and Mark. Well, my position is that the funding of the BBC through a hypothecated tax on television sets is anachronistic, and that state ownership of the institution is both stifling and inappropriate. I should add that my remarks really relate to television. I'm quite happy to talk about radio in the Q&A, but I think the considerations in relation to radio are a bit different from those relating to television. So the BBC has been financed by a hypothecated tax on television sets since 1946. And this and the public ownership of the BBC has been successively justified from a number of different perspectives. Firstly, it was suggested that spectrum scarcity required state intervention, although much of that spectrum scarcity was artificially created by the state in the first place. It's also been suggested that television channels are public goods because their benefits are not excludable and they are non-rivalrous in consumption. And the former is clearly no longer the case, and I think the latter argument now carries relatively little weight. The inappropriateness of using a charge on television sets to fund the BBC, I think, can be seen from both directions. Television sets are now used for a variety of functions. Indeed, the majority of streamed content is watched on a television set, and the BBC can be watched, of course, without access to a television set. And in fact, even many in the BBC accept that the TV licence as such cannot continue for much longer. But I think alternatives to funding the BBC from general taxation or from a tax on various forms of technological equipment, I think they will be a disaster for the corporation. The TV licence still does have its origins connected to when the BBC was a private company funded by a levy on radio sets produced by private companies, even if that connection is tenuous. As soon as the BBC receives some kind of funding stream that is directly a tax, I think it will no longer be at arm's length from its political masters. But the BBC is also, it will be starved of capital, limited in its commercial partnerships, and it will not be able to exploit the potential of innovation. Indeed, that's already happening. In the UK, 18 to 34-year-olds watch 7 times as much Netflix and YouTube as BBC One content. The average time, in fact, spent by all adults now watching Netflix and YouTube is greater than the amount of time they spend watching BBC One. the BBC tells us that compulsory licence fee funding is appropriate because the channel sort of brings us all together in front of our log fires to watch the Generation Game and that type of thing. But interestingly, in fact, young people are doing shared viewing more than they used to, and also viewing content for longer periods of time. But this is viewing of streamed content rather than viewing of broadcast content. It's also just worth noting in passing that the BBC is no longer the most trusted provider of news in the UK. Now, essentially what has happened to broadcasting happened around 200 years ago in the publishing industry. Technology improved, raw material costs fell in real terms, and real incomes rose. And as a result, publishing blossomed. And a similar phenomenon has now happened in broadcasting and content provision. We've turned from being a nation of shopkeepers into a nation of broadcasters. And in both broadcasting and streaming, there's a huge variety of genres delivered in different ways through different platforms, responding to different tastes and produced by different organisations. And this is similar to how bookshops, libraries, pamphlets, novels and newspapers all proliferated in the 19th century. In 1898, there were around 400 publishers in Britain and Ireland alone, and the growth in publishing both encouraged and was encouraged by the growth in literacy. And not only that, of course, it produced great quality literature which was read widely by the population. We didn't need a state-funded publisher in order to produce that great quality literature, which of course is still read today. Indeed, the parallels between publishing and broadcasting really continue down almost to fine details. So as well as a variety of formats, magazines, newspapers, serializations, books, pamphlets, etc., there was a variety of payment mechanisms, subscriptions to series or serials, pay per chapter, pay per book, subscriptions to lending libraries, and so on, which would allow readers to read as much as they wished in return for their subscription. And this is exactly now what is happening, or what had happened to broadcasting. I think in that context, it's a very strong argument that the BBC should be funded by subscription by those who wish to avail themselves of their services. And there's no justification in the modern world for requiring people to pay for television services they don't wish to watch. That leads us to the question of how the BBC should be owned. I don't think it can continue to be owned as a government-owned broadcaster. I don't think commercially a full commercial privatisation is politically on the table and will probably not be desirable. I think we should look somewhere else. And in a thriving free economy, especially in education, arts and culture, mutual and cooperative forms of ownership are very common. And I think that the BBC, actually following the original thinking of Sir Alan Peacock, should be turned into a subscriber-owned mutual. It would then be very difficult for either the political class or the commercial class to capture the BBC, but it could thrive as a free organisation, free from political control. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Philip, and thank you very much for trying to keep the time as much as possible. People have started asking questions. Please do ask questions using the Q&A function. Don't wait until the end. Let's hand straight over to Mark to respond to that, who I suspect will have a slightly different view. Mark, over to you.
Well, thanks for inviting me. So the BBC has declined, is declining, will decline further, and in terms of sheer numbers of eyeballs and eardrums, that's all true and highly likely to continue to be true. And at that point, I could fold my hand and say, you win. But of course, I don't think that's even half the story. Imagine you came down from Mars now and looked at the BBC, which has been subject to pretty fierce competition over the last 30 years, long before Netflix was invented. There was satellite and cable and the internet and Google and aggregators before we get to Netflix. And imagine you looked at its performance. And I were to tell you that every day 41 million people who, it's true, have to pay for it. And that's definitely an argument we're having about whether they should be forced to pay for it, 43p a day. But every day 41 million people who have plenty of other choices available decide that they want to interact with the BBC. Or to do that across a week, that's sort of 92% and probably slightly understated. It may be a bit more than that of the UK public above the age of childhood interact with the BBC. So you think that's quite interesting. can't be that bad. And then you say, well, how much on average are they interacting with the BBC per week? And I say to you, 18 and a half hours before COVID, probably a bit more too. And then you say, so how much do they pay? 43p a day. And it begins to look a bit different, really. The decline in the sheer number of eyeballs and eardrums is from such an incredibly high base that it skews the judgment into thinking of the BBC as in some ways as a legacy brand. All we're doing is talking about decline, as opposed to something which is central and important and loved and sometimes hated and passionately engaged in and infuriating and all the rest of it that the BBC does and stands for, because it is deeply, deeply embedded in British cultural life, not merely political life, but cultural life and social life and community life, all around for 43p a day through this rather apparently anachronistic funding system. So then you might say, coming down from Mars, well, that's all very well and good, but these people are all over the age of 70. And amongst the younger audiences, the BBC is failing very badly. And it is unquestionably true that the BBC is finding it very tough there with under 35s. And I can tell you, having been on the board of the VNA and at Oxford and various other institutions, that the notion of keeping one's relevance to a cohort of generations is quite a tough task. The BBC, and by the way, let's be grubbily empirical, I don't recognise Philip's figures, and please don't be seduced by them. I think that what I might do is offer Philip a marriage with the BBC strategy department to see whether we can get some agreed figures, but none of his figures stack up with me, including the trust and accuracy ones. The BBC is the largest provider of media for the under 35s, and by quite a substantial margin, again, pre-COVID. Yes, of course, Netflix is popular and jolly good, and I pay for it too. But the ratio of consumption between Netflix and BBC services is something like 9 to 1 in the BBC's favour. And let's take out the internet and let's take out audio and let's keep it to video. And that's 3 or 4 to 1 in the BBC's favour. And by the way, a lot of the people who are consuming Netflix are also consuming BBC programmes on Netflix. So although it's unquestionably true that the BBC faces challenges with particular audiences, and they're very, very serious ones. The BBC needs to demonstrate value to all of its audiences at least some of the time. It is simply not true that the BBC is failing. Let me go briefly to trust and impartiality. I spent a lifetime thinking about it and never cracking it. It's a really, really tough set of problems. The BBC falls from grace in lots of different directions, and the complaints come in from lots of different directions. It's not a perfect defence, but it's not uninteresting that the number who think the BBC is skewed to the left and the number who thinks the BBC is skewed to the right, not far apart, in fact. And when you ask the public, Ipsos Mori, time after time after time, and YouGov, the most trusted and accurate source of news in the UK, and you give them the whole spectrum of choice, BBC, Times, Guardian, Channel 4, YouTube, Google, a lot, the BBC is miles and miles ahead. But not even by a kind of margin you could say 8 or 9 times ahead. So for all these individual failures, and I'm very happy to talk about Rule Britannia or Brexit coverage or all the rest of it, and I recognise the BBC is perfectly capable of booting into its own goal from huge numbers of angles and distances, the BBC remains a towering influence in British public life, a towering force in news and current affairs with all its frailties and its weaknesses, and you get that for 43p a day. Doesn't have to be a licence fee, but what I can say is that destroying the universal principle that we all own it, not the state, not the government, it's the licence payer that owns it, off the background not merely of its historic success, but of its contemporary success, would be an act of sheer vandalism.
Mark, thank you very much, and for forcefully putting your perspective. For anyone interested, I put a link in the chat function to an article that Mark did write about the question of balance and how to get it right for Prospect magazine. You'll find that link in the chat function. I'll also put a link to Philip's paper, New Vision for BBC. Robbie, we've had the opening remarks. Julian, thank you very much for joining us. I will come to you later. Thank you, Julian Knight MP. Robbie, why don't we now go to you for your perspective on this debate?
Thank you so much, Syed. And just to say, I agree with a lot of what Mark has just said. But one point I just want to say, I really don't buy the argument that if you get complaints from I know you weren't precisely saying it this way, you get complaints from the right and the left, but probably doing it about right in the middle. You can actually be biased against the right and the left at different times. I'll return to the issue of bias in a second, and impartiality. I am a sort of BBC reformer, not a BBC wrecker. So if you go anywhere you did your example, Mark, from being in space. I'll do my example of suddenly appearing in Africa or Asia. And you ask, what are the 3 things you know about the United Kingdom? And I think it's likely they will say the Queen, the Premier League, and the BBC. So I think the BBC is a massive brand for this country, and whatever changes people advocate, and I am not someone that doesn't support change, it's crucial that it doesn't undermine this incredible global institution. The Institute of Economic Affairs, free market think tank, and supported by many conservatives. So I think from a conservative perspective, I think there are 2 basic criticisms that conservatives have about the BBC. One is the whole licence fee. That was the basis of Philip's introduction. That they see it as an unnecessary poll tax, and the public have to pay it whether they consume BBC content or not. And secondly, the issue of BBC bias, metropolitan, left-leaning, Tory, hostile, out of touch with the country it's supposed to serve. I want to deal with briefly the licence fee. If you were setting up the BBC now, you almost certainly wouldn't have a licence fee. However, we do have the BBC, and it is funded by the licence fee, a universal licence fee. And because we have that, that allows the BBC to provide service with incredibly good value. So let me just give you an example, just to try and say why the universality aspect is so important and why it is such good value. So if you purchase a tabloid newspaper every day for a year, it will cost you pretty much the same as it would cost to subscribe, to pay the license fee. And what do you get for your license fee? And I have a list here. It's quite staggering. You get 10 television channels, 11 network radio stations, 32 local radio stations, 12 regional broadcast hubs, separate programme output in Scotland, Wales and Northern Ireland. One of the most popular websites in the world. Anybody who goes on a train pre-COVID, that is, and you look at what people are looking on their phones, young people and others, they're looking at the BBC website. The iPlayer, BBC Sounds, and massive soft power with BBC World Service. And by the way, even the basic service for Sky package costs you about twice as much as the BBC license fee. So so that's not to say I don't believe in some kind of modernisation or reform of the licence fee. My personal view is that whatever you do to replace a licence fee, it needs to be some kind of universal charge. My personal view, it could be raised through the council tax with some kind of premium service top up on the iPlayer. But the key point is one that Mark touched on, is that because of the slightly unusual way of funding money, it does allow the BBC to provide services to the country at such a low cost. And I just want to touch on the subscription argument that was at the fundamental part of Philip's opening remarks. There are 2 main reasons why subscription wouldn't work. Firstly, technology. The free view doesn't allow the ability to turn off people that don't pay for the subscription. And secondly, radio. I mean, radio doesn't give you that option. So subscription technically at the moment doesn't work. But that's just but the second point is, let's say you did have subscription and half the number of people subscribe that currently enjoy BBC services. That would mean that you'd have to double the license fee for those people that did subscribe for no extra services. And for the other half of the population, they would suddenly, and often old people that rely on the BBC to be part of, would potentially not pay the BBC license fee, the subscription, because they wanted to make some services. So I'm not sure that's necessarily the right way forward. But as I say, I have been a critic of BBC in relation to bias. I've been banging on about impartiality, not quite as long as Mark, but I'm a late comer to it, but I feel equally passionate. So I've been very encouraged by Tim Davey's speech last week when he announced that impartiality would be his priority, not just one of the considerations that BBC programme makers must consider, but the priority, the number one, the starting point for everything. And I think for the BBC to justify itself in the long run, it has to provide something that the private sector is not providing, whether broadcasting or newspapers. Otherwise, there is no justification, in my view, for having the licence fee. I just want to run through some of the things that's happening in terms of impartiality. On social media, it's a thinly disguised opinion dressed up as impartial questions. So-called analysis, which is nothing more than guesswork and received wisdom. Narrative journalism, with selective use of evidence to make a case, to make a point that is at worst is a deliberate misrepresentation of the truth, and away from news, an appalling woke-dominated agenda with current affairs and comedy painfully out of touch with the people that pay the licence fee. So that is, for me, the main challenge for the BBC, plus some reform of the licence fee. And I could say that I'm enthused by Tim Davey's appointment. He doesn't need me to tell him that making a great start, a couple of good speeches, and dealing with a few pressing issues is enough to deal with the BBC. It's about delivery. Can the culture of the BBC change and actually deliver these necessary changes? Now, I'm an optimist, and I think under Tim Davey's leadership, those changes can happen, but I think it's up to all BBC staff to basically seize this opportunity, because with a combination of some of the sort of anachronistic aspects of the licence fee, the only way it can be justified is to make these changes.
Thank you very much, Robbie. Without much further ado, let's hand straight over to Julian Knight, who's the chairman of the relevant committee. I gave a longer introduction at the beginning. Julian, thank you very much for joining us. I'll hand over to you. I'll give you about 5 minutes for the floor. Thank you.
Yeah, no, thank you, Syed, and apologies for being late to the show, so to speak. Unfortunately, I have an invitation that you need to register, so I was waiting pending for a little while, just to make sure I wasn't some sort of some sort of eavesdropping journalist. I don't know, but anyway, look, I would concur with an awful lot of what Robbie's actually just said on terms of partiality. I would just add as well that the politics have changed, obviously. We have a lot of red wall colleagues, and they feel acutely the way in which the disconnect between the BBC and its audience, and it's something that's actually represented on the ground to them, and they tell like that all the time. If you want to, if Tim Davey really wants to understand the cross currents within the Conservative Party right now, I suggest he goes to a meeting of the Blue Collar Conservatives, sits down with them and lets them speak to him for an hour, and maybe perhaps he will get an even greater perspective. And I have to say, I too welcome his appointment, and I have to say it was almost a hallelujah moment when he issued his first speech the other day. But genuinely, though, many of my colleagues, influential now, obviously within Parliament, they feel as if there is that disconnect. They reflect it. And in fact, as someone who's been a BBC skeptic but a former BBC worker, I worked there for 5 years as a personal finance correspondent, I feel actually as always I'm now moved to the centre ground of my party, in fact, on this particular issue, because there are a lot more people who are much more radical in their approach, perhaps, and their ideas in terms of wanting to see reform of the BBC. I too am a critical friend of the BBC. I want to see reform. I want to see evolution, but quick evolution, rather than some of the sort of tectonic plate style movements that I don't think would do any good. But so in terms of partiality, I say that the politics have changed. I think Tim Davey has recognised that. I do think that woke culture is a massive sort of turn off for an awful lot of viewers. And I like to think that's now going to be recognised, and something that's a little bit more in tune with the values of the BBC, I think would be very, very welcome in terms of its output. Now, I also welcome some things he was saying in terms of a recognition, or in terms of the potential for a slightly slimmed down BBC to be available, what I've termed BBC Basic over time, in which people would be able to effectively choose potentially between different types of BBC output that they wish to receive. I completely get Robbie's point. It's one that I've actually made to the IEA and also in print as well, in terms of the difficulties of Freeview. The BBC, of course, had a hand in that, and the fact they made Freeview deliberately dumb, so that so basically the challenge of subscription would be a generation or so away. So I completely get that. Actually, one of the worst things potentially for a government to do would be effectively to say, okay, the BBC is going to turn to a subscription model tomorrow, and we're going to end up with on Freeview, and lots of our elderly constituencies' TVs are turned off as a result. And I can guarantee you that's one way to ensure that we're not forming a government next time. So you've got to be mindful of that. You also have to say that there needs to be, I personally believe there needs to be some form of subscription within the bloodstream of the BBC. I think that what needs to happen is that we need to see a reduction of the money that's actually paid out in the licence fee, reduced over time, and other income streams actually brought forwards. I also believe there is efficiencies there. I mean, Robbie used the example there saying, well, this would just mean a doubling off of cost of the license fee of half the people stopped effectively the number of license fee payers half. Well, actually what would probably happen is that the BBC would shrink in size. And personally, I think the BBC does too much. I think it squeezes out a lot of commercial competition, and has already done lasting damage, I think, to potentially certainly the online news architecture within our country in that respect, in terms of the sort of behemoth that is the BBC News website. So I would say that in that respect, I think that they need to look at a means by which to phase gradually away from the licence fee. That does not mean that we throw the baby out of the bathwater, that we do lose this huge benefit to our ecosystem as well in terms of cultures, arts, and also our brand overseas. But I do think we need to set staging posts over the next 5-10 years, give them proper targets this time, rather than, frankly, a cooked-up deal between George Osborne and Lord Hall, which really didn't serve us any good at all, and actually was a real missed opportunity. And then also, I'll probably turn now finally, or final thoughts in terms of decriminalisation. I mean, personally, I welcome decriminalisation. I know victims groups welcome decriminalisation. And I don't buy the fact that the BBC says that this will lead to 200 million reduction. It may lead to some sort of, many people deciding to basically not pay as a result, but I think with the potential for enhanced civil penalties, I think that should square that off quite nicely. And I think that basically, criminalisation licence fee is massively overdue getting rid of. I think that, that we're often referred to as the review we had in 2014 on this. And the realities are that's 2014, we're now in 2020. We have a completely different world. People are finding different ways to consume their media. And if you just, some of the research that you see, and BBC's own research in terms, for example, under 35 shows that so many of them actually don't watch it now. So I think that in that respect, therefore, I think that we, morally, I think that the license fee now is on the way out over a period of time, and that's crucial time, because basically I don't think it quite fits the patterns of linear broadcast and non-linear broadcast that we now have. Just final point I'd make is the committee is currently reviewing public service broadcasting. What we want to see is a very strong public service broadcasting, which really knits the country together, delivered to people in an impartial way, which effectively fulfills many of the aspects that we have seen in the past of public service, but also keys into future public service broadcasting needs and necessities, because basically it's a very great bulwark against fake news and disinformation. But the question is really, is that all just about the BBC? That's one of the questions that we're asking in that regard. It may be the massive sort of overarching everything that dominates public service broadcasting, but actually now we're seeing different strands and different ways forward.
Well, Julian, thank you very much. What I'm going to do before I turn to the Q&A, I'm going to first of all ask people who are viewing today to go to Q&A, and please add your questions. We've got just under half an hour to put questions to the panel. But what I'm going to do is allow a couple of people to come back. First of all, Philip, clearly you made your initial case for the subscription model. That has been challenged by all three of the other speakers, both on technology grounds, but also some of your figures, for example, where you say the BBC is no longer the most trusted news provider in the UK. Could you come back on those? And then, Mark, I saw you sort of disagreeing, or appearing to disagree with a couple of comments that Julian made. I'd like to ask you about that. Philip, over to you. Can you unmute yourself, Philip?
Yeah, I struggle with the argument really that the BBC is absolutely marvellous value, but if people were free not to pay for it, its audience would, or the number of people choosing to pay for it would fall by 50%, and therefore the average cost of provision for everybody else would rise by 50%. We don't tend to make that argument that Robbie made in the relation to the provision of other goods and services. I actually happen to think that the BBC provides a sufficiently good product that large numbers of people would want to watch it, and large numbers of people would want to pay for premium services. And the 95% of people who speak English who live outside the United Kingdom, only 1 in 20 of people who speak English actually live in the United Kingdom, that's an audience that, given more commercial freedom, the BBC will be able to tap much more readily and raise revenue from, thus spreading its fixed costs further. In relation to the figures, I couldn't find the trusted news source. I was just trying to look for that during Julian's remarks, but there was an opinion poll which put ITV News ahead of the BBC. It's true, most opinion polls put the BBC ahead of ITV, but that one reversed it, and the difference is not that great. On the issue of how much people watch the BBC as compared with other things, that's all in the Ofcom Media Nations report, and the figures have they've stabilised, but in the few years before 2019 moved rapidly in the direction of younger people, indeed the population as a whole, watching other services, including YouTube, pre-recorded stuff on YouTube to a greater extent than BBC One, and in the case of young people, to a much greater extent than all so-called public service channels put together. I accept the point, of course, in relation to how the Freeview technology has been set up, but we can't say that we should never change the way we fund the BBC because the way the Freeview technology has been set up. At some stage, we've got to cut that circle, even if we make a policy proposal and there's a time lag before it's fully implemented. You're mute, Syed.
I apologise. I didn't follow my own instructions. Mark, when Julian was making his points, I noticed that you appear to disagree, if I judge your facial expressions correctly. Do you want to come back on some of those points that Julian made?
Yeah, I mean, the BBC is 24% less well off in real terms than it was in 2010. So you can erode its funding base further and you will get fewer programmes, and you will sooner or later have your self-fulfilling prophecy that the BBC will lose relevance and decline, and so it's no longer worth the licence fee or any other form of universal funding because it simply isn't as potent as it once was. And the way to guarantee that is by letting it wither on the vine. And so you feel vindicated that you've shorn it of money and then it's been defeated. I don't guarantee that the BBC will continue to be as successful as it is now, because it's got plenty of struggles on its hands, particularly with younger audiences, and not only with younger audiences. But I can guarantee that it will fail if you decide to abandon a universal fee, which gives you huge economies of scale, which has provided this country with spectacular value over decades. And it's essentially a conservative argument, small c, and an empirical argument that for all its manifest fragility and weaknesses, I might want to come to the argument about impartiality if you'll let me in a second. The BBC is an enormously successful cultural and creative vehicle, imperfect as it is, and that what Julian is arguing for is really fried snowballs. I want a public service broadcaster that's got an international reach, has all this reputation, has done all these great things for British culture, but actually I'd rather not have it as something that everybody has to pay for, and rather I'd have it really quite a lot smaller if I could do, and then let's see how it goes. And all these poor people who have been shriveled and rotted by the BBC have made a very substantial living in the last 90 years with the BBC, a known beast in its midst. Many people are making money in good years, not now. COVID has laid to waste lots of different things, and I'm sympathetic, particularly to ITV and Channel 4 and Channel 5. But the notion that the BBC has crushed innovation and competition, and if you look at the media and culture sector as a whole, not only over the last 90 years, but now, it doesn't stack up that the BBC has eroded consumer choice and crushed it. Quite the reverse. It's liberated it. If I might briefly on impartiality, which is a incredibly complicated and important topic. So let's make a couple of concessions. I think the social media thing has been out of control, and I'm very glad that Tim said what he said. To give Tony his credit, I think he was beginning to be on it before he left. But clearly some of the things that BBC News presenters and others have done on social media would not be acceptable to me, and I'm happy to say that on the record. This isn't about the left and the right. Of course, Robbie is correct. Me merely saying that the Corbynites complain and various Brexiteers complain isn't a good enough defence. I also spot individual items. I won't list them now, even on the best of programmes where I'm throwing stuff at the radio and the television in despair. But broadly, and I'm making a broad judgment here, when I listen to the broad swathe of BBC output, do I think that it's fair-minded and trying and striving in its compressed medium, because broadcasting is a compressed medium, to represent some kind of multiple perspective and complexity in an argument? Well, the answer is, I think they still do it remarkably well. And the top-rated BBC correspondents and presenters do a remarkably good job of it. Frustrating though, and it may be if you know a lot about a story that you're not getting more. My beef is lack of intellectual ambition from time to time. I should be knowing more about what's going on outside the UK around stories that really matter in the UK at the time that they really matter. And I can be infuriated by that. But it doesn't mean that I think the BBC is in a cesspit of left-wing bias or even wokeness. The organisation that gave you the Rule Britannia row is also the organisation that every year, and this will continue to be the case, does the annual service of remembrance. It's the broadcasting corporation that gave you, by a factor of God knows how much more coverage of World War I between 14 and 18 than anybody else did. It's the broadcasting organisation that did the 75th anniversary of VE-Day on BBC One with spectacular production values at enormous cost. It's a complicated country, this. There are many competing definitions of what the public good is and what patriotism consists of. The BBC is trying to navigate that. It's difficult and it makes mistakes, Rule Britannia being one. But the notion that it's been paralysed by wokeness in all its output, I simply don't accept.
Thank you, Mark. Now, Julian, you're accused of frying snowballs. A wonderful expression. Do you want to respond to that? And then, Robbie, I'm going to come to you with a question on impartiality. Julian.
Well, yeah, thank you. First of all, my point was actually about decriminalisation and licence fee, which I just don't think it's correct to criminalise large numbers of people for not paying a licence fee. I think that, frankly, I think it goes countercultural now in the time that we are. And personally, I think that that perhaps what ought to happen is that there should be a higher civil penalty, and that the BBC ought to make a case stronger for why people should pay the licence fee in those instances, and make that argument rather than just relying on the courts. And the realities are that as that with a greater number of people who are choosing, unfortunately, to break the law, that you are going to find perhaps there will be more court time taken up due to the fact that people do their own defences, etc., etc. And although it doesn't take up a huge amount of court time at present, it does mean that we do criminalise portions of the population which, frankly, really shouldn't be criminalised. And actually, it's one of I think it's the largest reason for criminalisation of women in this country. So I think that frankly, just talking about fried snowballs and decriminalisation, I think frankly most people, if they were asked, I think right now would say, look, this needs to be an idea past its date. So let's try and think of a new architecture for this. When it comes to whether or not the BBC has effectively crushed innovation, now I do accept the fact that the BBC is a unique position in terms of being able to feed into our ecosystem and arts and culture throughout the country, particularly in Salford and in London. There is an argument here which I've made before about sort of bipolar organisation, but let's put that aside for a minute. An awful lot of jobs, an awful lot of creativity depends on the BBC. However, one does forget the fact that under Julian Knight's leadership at the turn of the century, the BBC deliberately went out in order basically to spread out as diverse as it could do to get its market reach, legitimately, I suppose, in many respects, as wide and as spanned as much as it possibly could. That actually transformed the organisation from being what it was to a real global player in that regard. So in its terms, it was success. But I don't believe there's any way you could argue that did not choke off some innovation that could have been provided by independent sectors and those in the private sector. Just ask newspaper groups, for instance, exactly what the impact is on local newspapers of the actual BBC News website, which is a great resource. But at the same time, could we have had a very different culture and architecture here? And then finally, I just want to say one thing about talking about bias and that sort of thing. I think, to be honest with you, no BBC, I worked at the BBC for 5 years. I went to many news meetings. One of the things I would always say is that no BBC person sits back and says, I'll tell you what, I'm going to be biased this morning. I don't believe it. I really don't believe it, actually. But what I do believe is that there is a culture there, a groupthink, which basically relates to background, to world outlook, if you like. And we think we've seen that really quite a lot with that disconnect over Brexit. And what really needs to happen, I think one of the big challenges to Tim Davey is to inject new blood, new ideas, real diversity in ideas into the BBC. And I think that is the way in which it answers those partiality questions. Thank you, Syed.
Thank you, Julian. That lines us up nicely for Robbie to discuss impartiality. Robbie, can I just ask you a variation on the question of impartiality? You've all mentioned impartiality when it comes to BBC News staff, as it were. What about other BBC presenters? Obviously, the obvious one is Gary Lineker. I know I've heard anecdotally people say to me, I don't mind Gary Lineker sound off with his political views, but I resent the fact I have to pay a license fee for it. I can't just switch. I can switch off, but I still have to pay for it. Do you think the impartiality should only be levied, if you like, on the BBC News staff, or should it be wider than that? And is that feasible?
The charge against Gary Lineker is his Twitter account rather than what he does on TV. And I think on TV, I don't think he does bring biased coverage into his match-of-the-day coverage. I think the Gary Lineker Twitter is a slight distraction from what's really important is the bias by journalists who are involved in the news output. I think people are less concerned, I think, about whether Gary Lineker is tweeting hostile things to Brexit than some of the bias that you see and opinion you see from some of the producers and correspondents more widely. But I do think the on-air scenario, and I was surprised to hear Mark's analysis. I mean, everything he said was absolutely right. The BBC do those things that he set out. But, just in terms of, the identity politics, the way in which the script, there was a Doctor Who just before Christmas during the election campaign that had an attack, a snipe at Brexit. I mean, it's absolutely extraordinary that you have an organisation, I remember my time at the BBC, where virtually nobody in editorial areas were supporting of Brexit. And it was like everyone were just sneery about the idea of Brexit. Now, that's absolutely fine. I've got no objection to people at the BBC joining with political point of view. Everybody have a political point of view, but at the time of when Mark was at the BBC and the time as I was at the BBC, it was always the rule that you leave your politics at the door. And what we've seen, I think, in recent time, that journalists join the BBC and they don't understand that issue about impartiality, that you leave it at the door, you use your expertise and insights on politics to the service of the audience. And it isn't just left or right bias, it's also a way in which BBC journalism is not distinct from other journalism, other broadcasters or newspapers. They're all fishing in the same sea. They're all trying to, as I alluded to earlier, provide sort of narrative journalism where they are selective in the information that they draw from the world, and it's more like gotcha. And it's all, again, I think, underpinned by what's happening on social media. You do a package or an interview where everybody gets very excited because you've landed a blow against the government or a politician, and that gets retweeted, and you get more Twitter followers and people talk about it and talk you up. But the key thing is that if you look at an individual's interview style or you look at their Twitter account, you should not be able to get any inference from where they're coming from politically, and I'm afraid too often that isn't the case.
Thank you, Robbie. Well, we've got just over 10 minutes for questions. I'm afraid that I didn't realise at the beginning that the vote function has not been switched on. I apologise for that. So I'm going to have to rely on my news editor, as it were, to select the questions for me. The first question, and if I could ask the panellists to be as brief as possible, and I'll try not to ask all questions to everyone, if it makes sense. The first question is directed at Mark Damazer. It's from Shayna Noah at PA Media. I think you've covered this slightly, but her question was Tim Davey right to make a U-turn on Rule Britannia?
Yeah.
Thank you.
No need to elaborate further. I mean, I can be sympathetic to the arguments that led up to it and understand them. But in terms of it's a yes or no decision about whether it's going to be sung in some shape or form at the last night, the answer is I'm absolutely happy with what Tim did.
Okay, next question, probably also aimed at you, but I can ask Julian to come in on this as well. From Charlie Manic-Spiel, a question about crowding out. Is the BBC preventing a thriving private sector, particularly of regional broadcasters and correspondents? Now, your initial reaction was, I heard you say, I don't buy that. But Charlie's asking, particularly of regional broadcasters and correspondents.
Yeah, look, I mean, it's very interesting that ITV has sort of gradually gone back to its true faith, which is to understand that its strength did lie in its origins in local and regional reporting and local and regional production before it became a federated structure. The BBC never could be in a position where it could lose faith with regional journalism and regional broadcasting because of the licence fee and because of the necessary commitments and obligations that the BBC has to provide things of quality across a range of different services. And regional news and local radio have always been important to the BBC because it's been obliged to be important to the BBC. Other people wax and wane, depending on their profits, the leadership, their ideological commitment, the regulatory structure, all of that. The BBC can't afford to do that. It's nailed, in my view, perfectly appropriately, it's nailed to the mast of providing proper regional broadcasting news and information, and it still does it extremely well.
Thank you. Julian, what's your view on that? So can you unmute, Julian? Sorry. Thank you. Okay.
Yeah, you're doing exactly what I tell everyone on Select Committee not to do there, by the way. Look, I'd say that, I come from a region in which we're desperately underrepresented by the BBC. We've got £12.50 for every licence fee spent in the region. Pebble Mill in Birmingham used to be a fantastic institution in a mailbox now is, frankly, a lot of human resource and one or two, a little bit of output there, but it's nowhere near what it was in that regard, and the organisation has become quite bipolar. And actually, to a certain extent, ITV is reacting to that, and perhaps also as they are stepping out and trying to be more regional in its outlook. However, what I would say is that, talking about this is maybe it's a little bit too late, actually. Maybe perhaps, the economics anyway just aren't in favour of the regional broadcast. The world is becoming dominated by West Coast culture. I was in the United States not too long ago when we talked to Mark Thompson, obviously ex-BBC, and he was suggesting effectively there'll be only half a dozen newspapers in the Western world within the decade. And we are becoming much more dominating in that respect. So maybe perhaps actually the relationship has now changed, that whereas earlier in that time I talked about before in terms of Greg Dyke and that massive sort of expansion of the BBC, perhaps now actually it's become now more a relationship where which the BBC now does things like the local democracy reporting and supporting that programme. So we have what was a legitimate question maybe 5 years ago, perhaps has become almost too late as a question.
Okay, Philip, I'm going to ask you very briefly. Do you want to come in on this about is it squeezing out or crowding out regional broadcasters and correspondents?
Obviously, the BBC has had its competition run-ins in relation to local broadcasting, its websites, local newspapers, and so on. But the point about crowding out, of course, is that we don't know what's crowded out because it never arrives in the first place because of the competition from the BBC. So it is quite difficult to comment on what we might have had we not had the BBC in its current form. Which is why I would like to see competition. But actually, I think my position in some senses is more small c conservative than Mark's, because if you had a subscriber-owned mutual, you'd essentially take the institution as it is, and we all know how conservative mutuals are. Yes, people will be free not to subscribe, and it could evolve from its current position. But I think that any attempt to move to a situation, which I think is inevitable the next 10 years, unless we do something like that, whereby the state is directly funding the BBC from some kind of tax on technology or general taxation, will lead it to be stripped down and will lead to part of the BBC being effectively directly or much more directly controlled by government. So I think you need genuine institutional competition as well as competition in the actual provision of services, different types of institution in the broadcasting space.
Thank you. I'm going to try and squeeze in 2 or 3 questions if I can. If not, I'll see what I can do. Next question from Nathan Eckersley, and I'm going to direct this to Robbie to start off with. If the BBC doesn't make reforms such as tackling woke culture, licence fee payment, and sticking to the core purpose of informing, education and entertaining, how will this affect charter renewal in a few years' time? I'll ask you, Robbie, and then maybe ask Julian for a quick view on that as well.
Yeah, I alluded to this earlier. I think the BBC is an important institution that needs to be reformed and defended, not wrecked. But it can only be justified in the modern technology, in the modern world, if it provides something that the private sector, the other broadcasters and newspapers are not providing. And so I think it is important that it provides impartial, accurate coverage, and it also needs to be in touch with the people that pay the licence fee. And that means not saying that you can't have sort of woke style programs, but it seems to be disproportionate in terms of the script lines in drama and the lack of diversity of opinion in relation to comedy and a whole range of areas. So the BBC needs to serve the audience that pays the license fee, and that means having a diversity of opinion and plot lines and coverage. So I think it will be in trouble unless it does reform, but I'm confident that the BBC have got that message and they will change.
Julian?
Yeah, well, I agree with what Robbie's just said there. I think they need to be more in touch and more reflective of the country, rather than perhaps more sort of wanting to bend the country to how it sees as it should be. I don't see that actually as Reithian values. I think that basically what they need to be is more reflective actually of where we are right now. And there is actually a sharp point coming up. I mean, we talked about charter renewal, but actually we've got the midpoint of the charter. And I think that's going to be much more of, because with decriminalisation likely to happen, that's going to be much more of a focus point for potential change. And I think at that point we're going to see what should have happened in 2015 happening now, so to speak, more of a more focused, more thoughtful overview of exactly how the BBC goes forward, how it survives, how it serves its community, and also how it works within the architecture, what we want from public service broadcasting going forwards.
Okay, next question. Mark, you may want to touch on this, but I'm going to ask you a next question. It's from Rushabh Haria, who asks, would the panel agree that the focus on 18 to 35 content, such as podcasts, has been misguided, partisan, and alienated traditional audiences?
Apart from that, he's happy. Well, if only. I mean, I've agreed that the BBC is having a real struggle on its hands because of the incredible competition for that age group, and the notion that it's over-skewed in its provision to that age group is extremely unlikely. I mean, podcasts on the whole is a success story, and by the way, the BBC has partly generated that market, where it's been a spur to other people who are interested in it rather than being an inhibiting block on other people interested in it. But I don't think that the BBC is over-serving or over-providing podcasts or any other form of media for 18 to 35s at the moment. That is an extremely important creative and conceptual and struggle for resources that the BBC has yet fully to resolve. Tony understood that, Mark understood that, and Tim certainly understands that.
Okay, to three of you, Robbie, Mark, and then Julian, Emily Ferguson at Daily Express, was the BBC right to scrap free TV licences for over 75s? Robbie?
Well, my understanding of what happened is that the responsibility for determining the over 75 was handed to the BBC by the previous Conservative government. And, you know, I think the figures are something like £750 million this would cost for the BBC. And therefore, you know, the money spent on programmes if they kept the same provision and give free TV licences. Well, they have gone forward with what is a compromise, and it's obviously been incredibly controversial. What I would say, picked up on what one area I would disagree with Julian on, is in relation to decriminalisation. What I think should happen is the over 75s issue, which is controversial, plus the decriminalisation should be pulled together as part of a licence fee review process and taken together rather than just picking off one element of it. Of course, it's always no one wants to start charging a section of society that previously got it for free, but it's important to remember that, you know, having it for free does add to the burden on other licence payers and the rest of the BBC. I just wanted to add a quick stat in relation to the decriminalisation. Even though there are quite a large number of people that are caught up in I think about 130,000 cases a year in terms of decrim, it only accounts for like 1% of the time by magistrate courts. So I think there has to be some way of making sure people do pay, because you can't, like any other service, turn off the service, whether you have Netflix or any other service, if you don't pay. And it has to be an efficient, sensible way to do it. And, you know, whether it's, I mean, I'm not quite sure whether decrim actually is the right way forward, because you can get into a whole load of other bureaucracy in relation to bailiffs and other things that come in with civil action. So what I would just say, tying directly with your question, is I think the over 75s issue, controversial ideas, should be taken together with decrim and rolled into a charter, into a licensing review.
Mark, do you agree with that?
It's an interesting thought, and thank you for it, Robbie. Not that I'm at the BBC, but on the broader question of the pensioners and the over 75s, I was on the BBC Trust, i.e. the governing body, when all of this was done in 2015. And I can assure you, because I remember the conversations with the Director General at the time, Tony Hall, that it is as Robbie says. The BBC never said that it wouldn't come back and look at it and take responsibility for it and decide for itself whether or not the over 75s would or would not get a free TV license. It was the BBC's responsibility to sort it out, and George, to his credit, I think recognises that's what the deal was. So the BBC has now decided that most over 75s will pay for it. So one of the glorious things that's happened in the United Kingdom in the last 30 years, far too little discussed, it's a very big change in demographic economics, is that pensioner income has risen and very sharply. There are poor pensioners. They ought to be protected if they're on pension credit by the concession that the BBC is going to continue for them. But pensioner income has gone up and up and up. The younger generation's income has not gone up and up and up. And so asking those over 75 who look as if they can afford to pay seems to me to be reasonable. And when you add to that the consumption of over 75s of the BBC, it is absolutely huge. It's the flip side of the under 35 demographic. That is to say, the BBC is doing less well under 35 and is doing spectacularly well in the over 75 demographic. So you're asking the more prosperous pensioners, is the broad swathe of them compared to the historical previous cohort, to pay for something that they use a great deal. The alternative is that everybody gets less because you're making less because you have less money. And that's another example of generational injustice. So unpopular though it is, and much as though I would have preferred the government to have gone on to the question, I think the people made the right decision.
Okay, Julian, I'm going to give you 30 seconds to answer that because we are running out of time. About the Z5s.
Look, the BBC shook their hands on a deal and should have followed through in that deal ultimately. However, it's quite clear that it was a bad deal, not the good deal that Tony Hall actually said. And there were clearly in very serious financial difficulties as a result. I do believe that perhaps the government should have come together with the BBC and discussed and seen a way in which we could have got to a situation where we got at least the next charter. I completely take Mark's points. I take Mark's points when it comes to increased pensioner income. That is absolutely spot on. But ultimately, you make a deal, you stick to your deal.
And Ben Glaze asked, why did the 2017 Conservative Manifesto promise to keep free licences for the over 75s for the duration of the Parliament, when the responsibility had already been handed to the BBC in 2015?
Well, of the many things that I've done in my career or not done in my career, I can assure you that one of them was not write the Conservative 2017 manifesto.
That question wasn't aimed at you, Mark.
I refer to Sir Robbie Gibb, who will be able to explain to you why that was put in. I really don't know.
Come on, Robbie, explain it.
I'm going to pass the buck because I joined number 10 after the
Right, okay, given that,
I think this is really problematic. There is no economic or moral case, as Mark suggested, for the over 75s receiving free TV licenses. It was given by Gordon Brown as a deliberate political device in order to ingratiate New Labour with that particular group. And by God, it didn't half work, because it made it almost impossible for any following government to rescind it. And actually, I thought it was quite a clever device by the Conservative Party to give responsibility for the BBC to finance that, and then the BBC had no option essentially but to withdraw it.
Well, not that I want to be accused of bias, but we're going to end on that note because we are running out of time. Can I thank our panelists today, Philip Booth, Mark Damazer, Robbie Gibb, and Julian Knight for joining us. Can I just make one brief advert, which is tomorrow night, Thursday, 10th of September at 6 o'clock UK time. Please join us for Live with Littlewood with a stellar lineup of guests to discuss current events from a pre-market classical liberal angle. Thank you all for watching or listening today. Please stay safe, and we hope that you'll join us again soon.